Hello, everyone. My name is Julie Garden Robinson, and I'm your host again for today's Field to Fork webinar. These are brought to you by North Dakota State University Extension, and we extend a special welcome if you are joining us from a watch party. We are celebrating a milestone in 2025. This is the 10th year we've done the series, and we're really glad you joined us today. We have reached thousands of people with information about growing, preparing, and preserving fruits and vegetables, along with best practices for food entrepreneurs. We have archived all of the more than 100 webinars from the previous years, and the link is always on our Field to Fork webinar page. The next slide shows our upcoming webinars, and we hope you join us for these as well. The next slide shows the webinar controls, and because of the large number of participants, we invite you to post your questions and comments in the chat. So let's practice. Find and use the chat box. Please ignore the Q&A box, by the way, because I won't be monitoring that. And click to open the chat and type your city and state or country, wherever you are, and your current outdoor temperature. It doesn't look like this, my screen at NDSU right now. It's snowing. The next slide shows an acknowledgement. As you work on typing in where you are, I have a special request. This program is sponsored in part with grant funding from the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service, and I'll ask each of you to complete a short online survey that will be emailed directly to your inbox right after or even during today's webinar. So please take a couple minutes to complete that. As a thank you, we are continuing to provide prizes to the lucky winners of the random drawings. Be sure to put your complete address in the follow-up form, including your city, state, and zip code. And also scroll down to today's date. Again, I welcome you to today's webinar, and I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Sam Markell is a Minnesota native who first came to NDSU in the 1990s to be an engineer and play football for the Bison. Sam played football for 4 years, and he says he survived 4 weeks as an engineer before he changed his mind and graduated with something more exciting to him. That was biology. And we're glad he did that because he later came back to us to work at NDSU. Sam earned a PhD in plant pathology from the University of Arkansas in 2007. Returning to NDSU as an extension plant pathologist, working with broadleaf crops. In his spare time, Sam, he says, mismanages his garden so he can collect great disease photos, which he's sharing with us today. So thanks, Sam, for joining us, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Julie. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. Can you hear me okay, Julie? Everything coming through?
Yes.
So I love plant pathology. I love agriculture, and my wife and I and our kids have always had a pretty good sized garden, at least for a city person. And I grew up for a first part of my life on a farm, and our garden was 3 acres. So a lot of that was sweet corn, but still, I love gardening, and I'm excited to talk to you about vegetables and a few things I don't often talk about. So as I get going, I want you to have a couple take-home messages that you can fall back on. And what I want you to do today, I first want you to, oh, froze. I want you to think about something called the disease triangle. And I'll spend a fair bit of time on this throughout the presentation, but I want you to think disease triangle. I want you to look for signs and symptoms. So we're going to talk about the difference and why that's so important in understanding what a disease is, identifying it, and eventually learning what to do about it. I want you to act in a way that thinks about something called integrated pest management, but really what I'm going to be talking about is managing the corners. So when you think of a disease triangle, we're going to focus on the corners of that triangle to manage it. And this all makes sense, I hope, after we go through this. The last thing is I'm going to end with a help. So if you get stuck we have help. You're not alone. I'm going to introduce you to the plant diagnostic lab and talk about some resources you might use. All right, so to accomplish all this, the outline more or less goes plants get sick. We're going to talk about that. That's kind of a novel concept for some folks. This disease triangle that I mentioned, we'll talk about that. And then we're going to go look at these signs and symptoms. And in this part of the presentation, we'll talk about some common diseases that you'll see on vegetables. And we're going to talk about handy manny. So handy manny, for those of you that have kids or have had kids that were young, maybe a decade ago, he and his toolbox, really effective way to think about the tools you have to manage plant diseases. And then, like I mentioned, we'll introduce you to the plant diagnostic lab. Okay, so the first thing I would mention is plants get sick. And I talk to my neighbors about what I do occasionally, and often the very first question is, what do you mean plants get sick? How does that work? Well, it's very similar to humans. It's very similar to animals. And when we talk about plant diseases, we talk about generally two groups. We talk about pathogenic agents. So those would be viruses, fungi, that sort of thing. Or we talk about environmental factors causing a plant disease. And so that's a bit of a novel concept. So I want you to think about this in terms of humans, right? So we have plants that get sick. Humans get sick too. So humans can get sick from just about any pathogenic agent that comes into contact with them. So whether it's influenza or COVID or athlete's foot or whatever unfortunate ailment you have, humans will get sick. Most of the time, there's a plant version of that. Influenza is a virus, well, plants can get viruses. Um, if you have something like fungal disease, a ringworm, or an athlete's foot, well, those are fungi. Well, plants get sick from fungal diseases too. So sometimes it helps to think about plant pathology in terms of humans or in terms of animals. So we know you can get heartworm of dog, for example, which causes a problem. Well, plants have nematodes too. So just in the back of your head, if you think about being a doctor, taking a sick person to a doctor, taking a sick animal to a vet, you can take a sick plant to a plant pathologist. And that's who you're talking to today. Okay, so the disease triangle. So this is a really important concept. So we think about disease in terms of when it would occur, how it would occur, what factors contribute to it in this philosophical visual triangle, where the size of the triangle is the amount of disease or the likelihood of an epidemic. And the triangle has three corners. So for disease to happen, you need a susceptible host. So when we talk about a host, in this case, that's the plant. The plant is the host, but not all plants are susceptible to all pathogens. And sometimes you can have plants that are resistant to a specific pathogen. But if you have a susceptible host, you really need that for disease to occur, or maximum disease to occur. The next thing is you need a virulent pathogen. So another corner of the triangle is the pathogen. Of course, you don't get disease if you don't have a pathogen or that environmental agent. But the pathogens aren't all virulent. They don't all cause the same level of disease. The more virulent, the more likely the triangle expands. And the last part, and this is the part in some ways for what we do is the most important, is the conducive environment. So environment changes a lot, and you have different pathogens that flourish in wet environments or dry environments, hot environments, cold environments. And when you see disease show up, you often are almost boxed in by that environmental factor of how quickly it develops and what damage it does. Okay, so the concept is you want to look at these three corners of the triangle to think about disease. And if you don't have one, or it's not very good, your disease is reduced dramatically. And so this, all plant pathologists really at the end of the day want to do is this. We want to knock out corners of this triangle so we don't have disease. Okay, so that concept is really important. So you want to think about the environment, the pathogen, and the host. Those three things will result in disease. Okay, so let's go through an example here. So I love this photo. This was the Iowa State Fair. Everyone knows what tomatoes are. Luscious tomatoes. I mean, this is obviously a tomato contest. My tomatoes don't look like this, but that's the target. So in our example of a triangle, this is the host. So you have the host here. You've got this beautiful tomato. Maybe it's resistant. Maybe it's susceptible to many different diseases. We don't know, but this is the target. This is the host. All right. Now, tomatoes have a lot of pathogens. There's a lot of pathogens floating around. And in this illustration, this would be, say, a bacterial pathogen. All right, so you've got two corners of the triangle, big, red, juicy tomato, sensitive to a pathogen. You've got the pathogen is there. You don't have disease unless that third corner of the triangle shows up. And so my garden, my home is just perfect for the triangle to complete. And so we have this garden, we've got tomatoes. Now, a couple of years ago, we had a nice hailstorm. So my kids ran out onto the deck and collected hailstones. I thought, okay, I'll take a picture of these. Keeping in mind that I didn't let them go out for maybe 5 minutes because I didn't want them to get pelted with hail. There's some good hail, dime size anyways, pea size, dime size hail. So the very first thing I did is like, okay, let's go see what's going on in the garden. So this is the environment, and all of a sudden it becomes conducive. So the second thing I did was actually get on the roof because I was afraid of all my roof vents. And you can tell by the impacts in this vent that the hailstorm was pretty significant. So the tomatoes, well, so I go into the tomatoes and I start taking pictures. They are that really red, juicy, like done. I'm ready to pick this and eat it tonight tomato. And they got hit by all these hailstones. So you can see all the little divots, the round ones, the little crescent moons. You can see all that. So that was maybe 6 hours after the hailstorm. Well, within 7 days, I was taking pictures of tomatoes again, and they're full of disease. It was just a catastrophe in my mind, right? But what happened was you have this host that's at a really sensitive stage. You got pathogens that are ubiquitous. There was no disease on these until the environment got right. And so when the environment hit, the triangle exploded and we have disease. Another example here of this tomato, this particular tomato took a really nasty hailstone right here, and you can see this crescent moon where the flesh is actually torn. Well, that provided an entry point when it was wet. A week later, that exact same tomato, this little crescent moon, is just full of bacteria. Okay, so you need each corner of the triangle, and then you get disease. I'm going to give you another example quickly, and this is a really historically important one. I'm not going to go into great detail, but it involves potatoes. Okay, so we have this potato. That's a host. Everyone knows what potatoes are. So this was just in my kitchen. I just took a picture of what we got. They're not the most awesome potatoes, but they're potatoes, right? Well, potatoes are not from this area, right? They're not from Europe. They have a really interesting, almost life cycle of their own. And so potatoes are originally from somewhere in South America. Let's see here. Oh, they're originally from South America, Chile, Peru, this area. And in the 1500s, 1600s, they went across, they went up to North America, and they also went to Europe. And this is a potato without the pathogen. So the potato is moving around, the pathogen's not coming with it. And one of the places they went was Ireland. And so Ireland and Northern Europe, I mean, if you've ever been there, you know the environment well. There was an article I read on the Daily Edge, a decade ago. It talked about the 11 levels of Irish rain, from just kind of gentle rain, pretty intense rain, crazy intense rain. So Ireland is wet. So the environment's wet. But you have wonderful potatoes. You have a wonderful environment, but you don't have the pathogen yet. And some of you may realize that that pathogen is really important. So it's called Phytophthora infestans. It's plant destroyer is what it means in Latin. This was really the first plant pathogen that was named and characterized. And the reason that it's so important here is that you have a potato that's sensitive to this. You have an environment that's wet, and your pathogen has swimming spores. So this particular pathogen is unlike many of the others. It's not actually truly fungi. It's an oomycete, what we would classify it as. So think more like algae. So the spores of this pathogen swim through water. So you can imagine if you have a wet environment, you've got a sensitive host, and you introduce this pathogen, you're going to have problems. And that's exactly what happened. So there's a really interesting research paper about a decade ago that walks through what happened that would eventually facilitate the Irish potato famine. The first piece of this is that potatoes originated in this area in South America, and the specific location is kind of moving around as science evolves. The pathogen originated in Mexico. And these two were causing some problems, but they weren't really in the same vicinity until the early 1800s when they moved through the US. And from the US, then they moved into Northern Europe in 1845. And that would precipitate what would eventually be the Irish potato famine. And so when it got to Europe, this is an expansion map of where the disease was found over time. And we're talking very short period of time, mid-July to mid-October, mid-July being the epicenter kind of in the Netherlands and Belgium. And by mid-October, they're in the edges of Italy, all the way to the edges of Ireland. So you have this really interesting scenario that would determine a lot of Irish, unfortunately, death, but Irish immigration as well. There's a lot of Irish people in the country. A lot of it dates back to this very plant pathogen effect. So what it looked like at the time, this is the particular disease called late blight. So you can see on the edges of these leaves, you have this infection. You have, if your eyes are good, probably hopefully better than mine, you can see the little white fuzzy growth on these leaves. That's the swimming spore. And so whenever it rains, the swimming spores, they go from the leaves to the soil and then they infect the tubers. And in a very short period of time, you might have a field meltdown. So this picture was taken by Gary Secor and Viviana Rivera in our department in plant pathology of a situation where they have uh, a late blight epidemic. This picture, I believe, was taken in Chile, fortunately, but we still see it show up once in a while in North Dakota. All right, so I want you to think about this disease triangle in the big sense and the small sense. So if you have a pathogen that you don't have anywhere near you, you don't want it. You don't want to end up like Ireland in the 1840s. But also in your own very garden, if you control the environment a little bit, maybe you don't have as much of a particular disease or pathogen either. Okay, it all kind of fundamentally goes to that disease triangle concept. All right, so back to the outline. We talked a little bit about this idea that plants get sick, and we talked a little bit about the disease triangle, and we're going to go more into that over the course of the talk. Let's talk about some of these signs and symptoms and some of the diseases we actually see in our garden. So one of the questions that I get a lot, especially from my neighbors or my friends, is how do you identify a disease? They all look like mold. They are all fuzzy. Everything's just rotting. How do you figure that out? And I admit it can be tricky, but it's a little harder than identifying a weed. You can kind of see it and touch it, figure out what it is. Same thing with insects. We all can see those little beetles. It's kind of hard to see spores, right? But we need to do that to figure out what the pathogen is. And the way we do it is we look for signs and we look for symptoms. And many times this is a new concept. We talk about it a little bit in human pathology too, but signs and symptoms is kind of new for plant pathology, or at least it's a little bit unique in how we look at it. So the first thing is signs are like the gold standard. If you see signs, you can usually figure out what the pathogen, what the disease is. And signs are the structures or the products of a pathogen on or in disease plants. So you're actually seeing something that the pathogen is creating itself, that white fuzzy growth, little black dots, things like that. If you see those, that's a sign, and you're really close to being able to identify it. But understanding that you need to look for it is maybe the biggest key. Now we have symptoms too, and symptoms are helpful. That's the expression of a disease by a plant or a response to the pathogen. So my symptoms, if I get sick, if I get influenza, my symptoms are, watery eyes, I'm sneezing, I'm doing all that. The sign might actually be the virus itself, which you're not really going to see. Okay. So this is a really important concept. So just a couple of quick examples and differences. So with a symptom, we're talking about it dies, right? So you see a plant, it's dying. That's a symptom. We don't see the pathogen on it. We just see the plant that, it's dying. A wilt. We see plants wilt all the time. Plants wilt in my garden constantly, unfortunately, but constantly. That's not the pathogen. It's just the symptom. It's wilting. Many things can make it wilt. It's a wilt symptom. Something called chlorosis, which basically means yellowing. When plants yellow, they only have a certain amount of ways they can show you that they're sick. And yellowing is a really common way. Damping off, that's when something might die very early. Sometimes you put a seed in the ground and it just never emerges. And if you dig it up, it'll be rotted. The pathogen killed it, causing a damping off. It damped off. Now, that can happen after it emerges too. And we see that many times where you have a plant and it's only this big and it dies. And then sometimes you get colored streaks. And many of you have probably seen colored streaks. There's a couple things that can cause them, but viruses are one of the most common. As opposed to signs where you see fungal growth, you see white or gray fuzz, you see fungal structures, little black dots, you see ooze from bacteria, maybe you see spores themselves, not individually, but in big clumps that have a color. Maybe it's a cluster of orange spores, for example. Okay, so let's look at a few of these. So this is a disease called downy mildew of sunflower. Okay, sunflowers are great crop, great ornamental, great plant. Downy mildew is a disease that causes really significant chlorosis, this yellowing, and causes stunting. So this downy mildew plant is exhibiting symptoms. It's yellowing, it's stunting, okay? If you take one of those downy mildew affected leaves and flip it over, you're going to see something different. So this is a white fuzzy growth. This would be the sign. Okay, so when I talk to farmers sometimes in commercial sunflower production fields, we'll see something like this where they have the yellow leaves and it's stunted. It looks like maybe it could be something else, herbicide injury or whatever. But if we start digging around and looking, flipping leaves and see this white spore shape take form, we know we're seeing the sign. Okay, here's another sunflower example. I like sunflowers, I can't help it. So this is a sunflower plant, and this is yellowing. It's almost glowing yellowing. Well, this is a symptom. In this particular one, it's called apical chlorosis, but this is a symptom because we're not looking at the pathogen itself. We're looking at the expression of a sick plant. This is something that you might see in your garden if you've got really good eyes or a magnifying glass. So this is called common blight of bean. And common blight is a bacterial disease. And when you have a bacteria disease, you will see sometimes oozing, So think about an infection in your hand or your arm, and you're infected with bacteria. Sometimes that's kind of nasty. It's kind of weeping, that's kind of gross, right? But when you see it here, that is actually the sign. So if you've got good eyes, you got something going on your beans or your tomatoes or whatever, and you have a morning that's wet and you see this oozing, it's bacteria. Here's the last one I'll give you as just a quick example. So sometimes you'll see little bumps, little bumps that are on plants. Maybe it's in a dead leaf, maybe it's in a living leaf. All of those little bumps are the pathogen itself. And in this particular case, it's called common bean rust. So this shows up on beans. Some of these pictures I took from my garden, some of them I took from fields. So you see all these little bumps, that's another sign. White mold is a really common one. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later, but sometimes the pathogen signs are actually pretty big. So these little black structures that look almost like mouse droppings, that's the pathogen. That's what it's overwintering as. Okay, so signs and symptoms is really important. And I would encourage you, as you're looking at things, look closely, because if you can find the signs, you can usually, you're just money ahead in identifying the problem you have. So I'm going to go through a few common types of diseases and give a couple examples. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to break it down by pathogen group, and we're going to start with fungi. So I want you to ask yourself, how many of you have seen this on squash, lilacs, roses? I'm kind of imagining all of you have seen this. Okay? This is a disease. And this particular disease is really interesting because the pathogen's living on top of the leaf itself. It's sending in little structures that go into the plant and they feed on the cells, extract nutrition out of it. And as a result, you can actually rub this stuff off. And if you've touched this in the past, you probably realize that. So I took this leaf and I scratched off my favorite university, which I hope you can see there. Okay. This is a sign. This disease is called powdery mildew. And I'm starting with fungi because they make up about 75% of all plant pathogens. And that, as a note, that's probably one of the biggest differences between diseases of humans, diseases of animals, and diseases of plants. We worry most about fungi. And maybe that makes sense. You know, I can take a shower and rub off my feet and probably am not going to get athlete's foot. Plants cannot take their roots out of the ground and scrub them down and go to a different soil they like better. Right. So fungi are really common in plant pathology. And powdery mildew is one of the most common diseases that you'll see. So powdery mildew is very host specific. And this is a really critical concept that's not intuitive. So some of these plant pathogens really only like a certain plant or a certain plant type, right? And when they only like a certain plant or a certain plant type, we call them host specific. So powdery mildew is that type of pathogen. So there's a powdery mildew of peas, of squash, of lilacs, of roses, of grass, turf grass, whatever it is, but they don't go to those other hosts. You'll see them show up at the same time. You might see powdery mildew of squash, like I've got here, and you might see one on your peas at the same time, but they don't cross infect. What's happening is this pathogen group is just everywhere. We call it ubiquitous. And when the environment is right, they all tend to infect at the same time. So you can have an infected lilac right over the top of your garden. It's not going to have any impact with what happens in the garden, except maybe shade. That's its own thing. But the pathogens are host specific. This particular pathogen and pathogen type is called obligate, meaning that for this pathogen to live, it has to live on a living host. So this is interesting. So you see this pathogen and powdery mildew living on top of the leaves. It's living there, it's extracting its nutrition from those little haustoria that are in the leaf itself. And if you take that away, it doesn't survive. It has survival structures, but it doesn't live anymore. Now, at the end of the season, this particular pathogen is going to produce some black structures. And those black structures are how it survives the winter or whatever. Okay, that's the first one. It likes warm and dry climates with really high humidity. So sometimes what you'll see is in the garden, it'll get overgrown. Mine gets overgrown. It gets overgrown. It's really humid all the time because I probably overwater it. It's dry and hot in August. Powdery mildew will hit, and it'll be all over the place. It'll be all over the yard, the trees, and whatever, but it'll especially be in my garden on the lower leaves. And so that's how that one works. So another fungal pathogen or fungal group of pathogens is called root rots. Now, root rots can be caused by a few other things as well, but most of them are fungi. And this is a picture of peas. Now, this is peas. So we planted some peas and they came up and immediately they started to die and go back down, right? So this is caused by multiple pathogens, most of them fungi. Now, they cause typically a symptom called damping off, which I explained. You come up and you don't make it, right? But they also can cause all the way up to a wilt. So a plant is maybe yay tall and it's doing just fine, and then it starts to wilt as it starts to produce fruit. And that is often caused by root rots. So just because it's mature or it's putting out fruit or whatever, if the whole thing starts to die, that might be actually caused by a pathogen that infected it 2 months ago. It's finally starting to take down the roots. So this is field peas. So I work with broadleaf crops, and we grow a lot of field peas in North Dakota. And lots of times when you have a root rot pathogen, you actually don't see it until it looks like this. So you might intuitively think, well, it just drowned out, the water killed it, and maybe that can happen. But more often than not, it's the water's providing a favorable environment for infection. It's that corner of the triangle that the water is using to kill the plant. So here's another example. This is a field pea that's wilting. Okay, so I mentioned the damping off when they die like this. Well, this one is getting pretty big and it's just starting to die. And what is that? Well, it's still caused by a root rotting pathogen. And so I took this particular field pea and I took a knife and I sliced it down through the center and close to the soil line And you can see all that reddening. And that reddening is caused by a pathogen. In this particular case, we see wilting caused a lot by fusariums, sometimes rhizoctonias, sometimes other things. This one is definitely a pea wilt pathogen. So I mentioned that this particular pathogen on potatoes, that this one that caused the disease late blight and precipitated the situation that would eventually become the Irish potato famine, needs it wet, and it's those swimming spores. So again, one of the points I want to make here is that sometimes you might think, well, these plants are just drowning out, and it's the water that's killing them. That might not be the case. You can imagine these things, these swimming spores aren't going to go very far if you don't have a wet soil condition. So when you flood it, you might have an epidemic occur. Okay, another fungal pathogen that you'll see is called white mold. Now, white mold produces white fluffy growth, like you might imagine, and it produces hard black structures. So here's a bean, and you can see this disease is taking hold, and this white fluffy growth is the sign. And it's causing this plant really to wilt and die. And if you watch this for a couple more weeks, it'll look like this, and you'll turn kind of this bone colored white as the plant dies, and they'll have all these little black structures in it. This black structure here, in this case, is called the sclerotia. It's a sign, and that's very important to observe in your garden, in your field, or wherever. Now, something that is really common here, when we get cool and wet, you'll see this everywhere. So if for those of you that have been around a while, remember 2008, 2009, it's really cool and wet summer. I had this everywhere. Crop fields, production fields, gardens, everywhere. And something very different than powdery mildew here, it is a broad host range, meaning that the same pathogen can infect about 500 plant species. Okay, so the powdery mildews of the world are very specific. This one is very broad. This is just an example of it being broad. So here's a sunflower, and you can see this thing is spreading from an infection in the stem to a brand new healthy leaf. If this leaf were to touch a pea or a bean or something else, the infection would continue to travel. Okay, fungal leaf spotters. Here's another one. This is a group. So most pathogens have multiple fungal leaf spotters, and many of them have signs. So here's an example of a fungal leaf spotter. And so this is not a super common pathogen, but it's very visual, which is why I chose this. So I took some pictures of peas, and you can see that there's these lesions, right? There are brown areas in the leaf. Doesn't look great, but right in those lesions, you get these black specks. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. You can see those black specks. If you have the ability to observe those, take a picture of them, whatever, you're 90% home figuring out what this is. That is the pathogen structure itself. Here's another one I mentioned earlier, common bean rust. So there's black specks, kind of brown specks on this one too. This one's interesting. Most of the black specks you see can't be rubbed off, but this case they can. So we see common bean rust, it's mistaken commonly for soil splash after a rainstorm or watering or something, but actually those are all spores. So I took my thumb and I went across the bean and took a picture of it. Those are spores. Another thing about common bean rust is that you'll sometimes have a halo. So you see these black specks and then you see this golden halo around. Now you're looking at a sign and a symptom. And there's really nothing else that looks like this in beans. So if you can see those, you can usually figure it out. Okay, just one thing about bacteria, a couple things about abiotic and stress, and then we'll move on to another section here. So bacteria are interesting. We think in humans have a lot of bacterial diseases. We just do. Plants have some. They're not a ton. Remember, most of the plant pathogens are fungi. One of the things with bacteria is they don't have these fungal signs, right? So if you see that white fuzzy growth or those black specks, those black hard structures, you can immediately rule out bacteria. You know it's not bacteria. Bacteria do have ooze though. And I took this picture from APS, which is our professional organization, because I think this is gummy stem blight, but I'm not 100% sure. But you can sometimes see the oozing of bacteria, the slimy stuff. It turns out to be shiny. And if you have a lot of bacteria, it'll dry out the plant and you'll have almost like a shotgun shot it, so a shot hole appearance. You need wounding and water to get bacteria. And wounding and water. It's not all that different actually than humans, right? So I could be in a I could be in an environment shaking all kinds of hands, probably not going to get a bacterial infection. But if I've got cuts on my fingers, that's when you get nervous about bacteria. That opening and that laceration of tissue, human, dog, plant, whatever, that's when you usually see an opening, and that's when bacteria can take hold. So a really common one is common blighted bean. And we usually see this after hail. So the pictures I took in my garden, I also saw some of this. And I wasn't on my game enough to take pictures of it. So this is from one of our field plots. But you have hail or edge of a field with blowing sand, you get water in it, you'll have this disease take hold. And I mentioned that it can be shiny. So here you have a bean pod, and this is a pinto bean, this is a field bean. Look at all the kind of wet looking, shiny little lesions on that. Okay. That's a very different look than what you see with fungi. And if you see those wet lesions, look in the middle of them, bring them in, put them in a little plastic bag with a little water. And if you see that oozing, you've got bacteria. That's just classic bacteria. And it shows up many ways in many crops. Now, this particular one is specific to beans, but there's usually a bacteria pathogen or two for most of the plants we grow. Okay, so plant pathologists, our job is to do everything wrong, right? So we're really fortunate to work at a university here at NDSU, and so we needed some help to get a bacteria epidemic in our field plot, so we could figure out what varieties were better, or we could figure out what fungicides would work. And so what we did is we worked with engineering. So we have some, we are plant pathology, we're agriculture, they're engineering. Well, we're better if we work together, right? So my little group of plant pathologists, supported some senior project development for the engineering students. And the goal was to help create an environment where bacteria would infect our plants. And so these three on the bottom, kind of dressed a little more fancy than my guy on the top, they designed this basically bazooka that shot little ice chunks or frozen peas or dead peas into the plants, lacerated the tissue. We did it at a rainstorm. We created bacteria epidemics. I just wanted to share this to you. It's a great photo, and it's really nice to be able to work at a university where you've got some really creative minds working to help you out. All right. A few other things. I'm not going to go into detail just because of time, but we have viruses in plants. We have nematodes in plants. This particular picture is a nematode. So on the roots, you see all these little white cream structures. Those are little worms. Each one of those white structures actually has about 200 worms. And we have viruses. Viruses produce some of the most unique symptoms. This is a garden pea that had a virus in it, and you can see the modeling. And I have a picture of Sherlock Holmes down here because when I did my PhD at the University of Arkansas, they had lots of virus problems. They grow a lot of vegetables, and viruses were all over the place. They had great vectors, great environment. And one of my professors was advertising for somebody to help work with her. And right on the application, it said, smokers need not apply. And I thought, how can you get away with that? Well, viruses, some of them are so stable that they'll survive in tobacco. Like this guy in his pipe, a virus could survive in that. So if he touched that, then touched her tomatoes, he could transmit that virus into the plants. So just an example of how robust some pathogens are. The last one I'm going to share with you before we move into something else is probably the disease I hate the most. I'm okay with most diseases, right? I'm a pathologist. I hate this one because you're so close to home, and blossom end rot can just eat your lunch. And this is really an abiotic issue. It's related to calcium. I'm not going to get into it too much. I'm not an expert here. I've never been able to manage it very well myself. But you think abiotic, right? So not a pathogen. How can that cause a disease? Well, what are two of the most common diseases in humans? Heart disease, that's not caused by a pathogen, really. Cancer, and it's not really caused by a pathogen either. I mean, some of them can be, right? But it's more related to abiotic things. And we have that, unfortunately, in plant pathology too, especially this one, which this one I really hate. Even watering can help. Calcium needs to be available. If you have this, there's things you can do about it. It's a tricky one, but I'd look it up. Okay, so we talked about plants getting sick in the triangle and quite a few common diseases that you might see. The last couple things I'm going to talk about relatively quickly are management. We're going to touch on Handy Manny and his talking tools and the plant diagnostic lab, a resource that could help you. All right, so before we get into Handy Manny, I just remind you, you've got the disease triangle. If you can manage a corner, you can really help beat down disease. But you're better if you manage multiple corners. And I'm talking about managing the corners of that to try to shrink it in every direction. And it also helps reduce the risk of a management failure. So you can do everything you want to the environment, water correctly, not over fertilize, whatever. But if you've got rainstorms constantly, that's not going to help you out. If you're trying to control something by reducing water or watering correctly, and Mother Nature is not helping you, you're still not going to manage it. So you want to manage every corner as much as you can. And what I usually talk about is the toolbox, right? So you've got a toolbox of things you can use. Maybe that's genetic resistance, maybe it's moving the pathogen out, cultural controls, maybe you're using fungicides in your environment. Whatever those are, attacking the corners is money ahead. And my kids watched a lot of Handy Manny, so these singing tools, they have a purpose, but they're a whole lot more effective when they work together. And for those of you that have seen it, you know what I'm talking about. All right, so the corners. So the first corner is the environment. One of the things you might want to consider is watering. Watering is a really significant facilitator of disease. Talking about rainfall, are you overhead watering into a garden? Is it foggy for like a week in a row? Because, oh my God, there's so many pathogens that need that for infection. You also want to think about proximity to fences and tree rows, and shade can influence how long dew will stay on plants. And thinking about the canopy, so I'm that guy who puts a ton of stuff in the garden or wherever I can, and usually I get a lot of disease, and I'm okay with that because I can talk about it as long as we still get some tomatoes. Temperature makes a difference. You're not going to have the same pathogens in a cool year as a really hot year. And human activities matter. Are you bringing in soil amendments? And you bringing in soil? What's in that soil? Pathogens move in those soils. Did you bring something else in? That's something to consider. The host. So we talk about hosts, and we often talk about resistant and susceptible, so varieties. So as an example, I just went to Burpee and I looked at different varieties of tomatoes. And so I did my PhD in Arkansas. So we're going to look at Arkansas Traveler here. Well, they've got some information about resistance, and they've got this V and this F. Well, what are those? Well, usually they'll have a code, and you'll see V is verticillium, F is fusarium. Well, both those are wilts. If your tomatoes are wilting, you can't figure out what it is, you might want to consider something with resistance to the wilt pathogens. Arkansas Traveler would be a good one to consider. The next thing is that when you have that, it can be night and day. So this is my lawn, which, I wasn't the one who was there first, but they put in two different varieties of grass, and you can see clearly one of them is resistant to powdery mildew, this one of them is susceptible to powdery mildew. And that's really important to know. You might consider multiple varieties. And this is an example of this was turf grass. When I was in Arkansas, we did a lot of turf grass work, a lot of golf courses, that sort of thing. There's a rust epidemic here. And you can tell exactly where those different varieties are by how red they are. And the reason they're red is the pathogen's red. I mean, you would imagine this, instead of being rust, instead of being turf, maybe this is tomatoes in a garden or something. And instead of using one variety because you really like it, you use 10 different ones. Well, pathogen shows up, causes disease. You don't lose your whole crop, you just lose a few. So the concept of multiple varieties is really helpful. Another thing to mention is stress. We don't want to stress out the plants. And the last piece of the corner is the pathogen itself. Sometimes you might want to consider where you had disease and how far away you are. So residue is a really common way that pathogens survive the winter. Think about those black structures. If you have black structures, they're probably surviving the winter. So getting rid of the previous year's residue is really important. If you plant into residue that had disease, you will have disease as long as the environment plays ball with you. Think about soil movement, pathogens, root rots, they live in the soil. And did you plant infected seed? So if you've ever wondered why seed lots of times is colored blue or red or pink or whatever, well, that's because there's a seed treatment on it to try to prevent the pathogens from infecting the seed. And sometimes, if you can do that, you don't move pathogens around, but seed can be infected occasionally. Keeping your own seed becomes a little risky. All right, the last thing I was going to mention is sometimes you got to call in the big guns. So another cartoon from what my children would watch. You may or may not recognize this. So My Little Pony is going to call in the big guns here. You do, and you should take advantage and have access to a plant diagnostic lab. So certainly at NDSU, we've got one. They're run through NDSU Extension, and I always recommend that folks that use the plant diagnostic lab work through the county agents because they have lots of resources too, and they may just simply know what the problem is if you can't figure it out. But you can work through the plant diagnostic lab independently. It's just my recommendation. The county agents might be able to save you some time, and they have direct access to the diagnostic lab. There's a cost associated. It's pretty minimal unless you get into some high-tech virus testing or something. And the results come in maybe days, maybe weeks. It depends on what it is. So let's pretend you send the sample in. Let's pretend you're like, I'm stumped. I can't figure it out. I don't know what just destroyed my plants, but it's not going to happen again. I'm going to figure out what it is. I'm going to send in a sample to the diagnostic lab. What first will happen is you have a submission sheet, right? So all the things that we talked about are things that you want to include. So I'm going to blow up the bottom here, and I know this is a little fuzzy, but they only put symptoms here because signs can be confusing unless you know exactly what you're talking about. But so they have signs and symptoms mixed. So let's pretend you put your sample in. You're going to fill this out. You're going to say, well, it's yellowing and it's wilting. It's affecting the stems, the roots, and the leaves. It's showing up in low areas, wet on the edge of my garden. Drainage is moderate, but low spots really suck because that's they're not that great, right? So tell them everything you can, thinking about the disease triangle. They'll take that and they'll start looking. So this is a bean sample that we had this summer. We started cutting it open, looking, immediately recognized that, well, we know what this pathogen is. That's why the plants are wilting. Here's an example of a sunflower. This is a bacterial stalk rot. It's so nasty and stinky. If the grower had cut that open in the field, probably would have realized that maybe that's a bacterial pathogen, but sunflowers are tough. It didn't come out anywhere. You have to cut it open and find it. Well, we know what this one is. Here's a poor sunflower. My goodness, this particular one had a bacterial head rot. It had white mold. It even had a rust. So obviously, sometimes multiple pathogens can hit the same exact plant. All right, so once it comes in, we'll take a look. We cut it open. It might go to Amy, who's an assistant diagnostician, who'll grow it up, take a look for structures, look for the signs. Maybe it goes to Suzette, who's the diagnostic lab coordinator. She's the director of it. She, in this particular picture, she's looking for spores themselves to identify it. And these two are excellent, and so is Christine, and they hire a couple of graduate students in the summer, and you have access to them, and I would encourage you to utilize that. All right, so I'm wrapping up here. Take home messages again. I want you to think about the disease triangle and what you do. Think about those corners of the triangle, the host, the environment, the pathogen. Look for the signs and the symptoms. If you can find the signs, you're money ahead. It's great. I want you to think about managing the corners of the triangle, this integrated pest management. If you can manage a couple corners, you're probably going to be moving pretty close to disease management. And then if you need help, the plant diagnostic lab is there. Okay, a few thank yous to some of the photos that were contributed by Andrew, Gary, and Viv. And it wouldn't happen without Julie Scott, Julie Scott and Anna. Oh, did I spell her wrong? Name wrong? Oh, all right. Anyways. Okay, if there's any time for questions, I'm happy to try to help.
You have about 10 questions, so I'll make this quick. Succulents are very popular. Have you ever done a seminar on plant path of succulents?
Oh, I have not. I have not. That's really interesting. I like succulents. I know a lot less about them. Um, there's room for me to learn. I haven't done one, but I like that idea.
And I'll just have all of the participants, if there are certain topics that you'd like for next year, because we will do another series next year, be sure to include that when you fill out your survey. Okay, if you had picked the hail damaged tomatoes, Sam, and brought them indoors to ripen, would the disease have been prevented? Came in.
In that case, probably not. So the particular pathogen would it develops pretty quick, and in the lacerations, that bacteria is in it right away. And so, like the one that had the little crescent moon where you could see the big laceration, he was a goner. So I could have cut it out right away and eaten half of it, maybe. But yeah, it's really tough with hail. It's really tough. Some of them will survive. The ones that are not lacerated kind of had that little round yellow thing. We did keep those. We did pull them in, and as long as the skin wasn't lacerated too much, some of them did make it. But most of the tomatoes in my garden after that storm were toast. It's really unfortunate.
Next question. If you take the black structures off and destroy them, does it do anything to keep the disease from spreading?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the answer is unfortunately it depends. Okay, so the black structures sometimes will produce more spores and send them out all over the place. And when those pathogens happen, the answer is actually yes. If you take those fruiting structures, what we call them, and get rid of them all, pathogen has a hard time. It's like reducing your inoculum, is how I'd say that, but not always. Sometimes the black structures are survival, and the black structures don't even do anything. They don't even contribute to spread until the next year, and they have to go through kind of this winter phase. So the answer is kind of yes or no. Over time, so thinking in terms of short and long, the answer is almost always yes. So that one they call white mold with the big structures, they don't do anything the same year they're formed, but it's really important to get rid of them because they cause problems in the next year. So it kind of leads to this bigger idea that one of the most important things, especially if you are a homeowner, is to get rid of that residue. Residue is full of pathogens. There's a kind of a famous example with apple scab, right? So apple scab is nasty. I don't like apple scab, but it will survive in all the infected leaves. So you got to get rid of those leaves. I don't like raking leaves, but I will to get rid of apple scab. It'll survive in that residue.
We've had a couple along this same line. What are some ways to manage pathogens in your garden from year to year, especially when dealing with leftover plant material?
Yeah, it's a little tricky. So with a garden, the very first thing I think about is the water, right? So a lot, not always, but a lot of pathogens need water. If you're watering overhead and you're getting all the leaves wet constantly, or you have just like a lawn sprinkler over the top, it's easy, but it can contribute to leaf wetness. And when you have leaf wetness, spores can infect. So you might want to consider, if you have to do it that way, you might want to consider doing it when you're going to have evaporation occur really, really fast. It's not the best situation to water for water usage at like maybe 2 in the afternoon, but it will dry quick. In reverse, if you've got a lot of dew already, maybe that's the time to water because you're not getting it more wet, you're just keeping it wet, and it's a shorter block of time. So the environment is part of it. Rotating where you grow things is important, especially if you have something that's really wide or maybe even two little gardens. Make sure you're rotating. Give the plants a chance to be away from that residue or the root rotting material. Um, so those are important. And then genetic resistance is really helpful. I showed you the burpee. It was burpee.com, just pops up. If you can get different varieties with different combinations of genetic resistance to different things, that's very, very helpful.
Can you compost diseased plants?
You can, yeah, you can. And I'm not an expert in this. I actually would defer to Esther McGinnis. I don't know if she's talked to you, but she's a master gardener. So yes, you can compost it. Compost increases the temperature to pretty warm, but I don't know if it's high enough to kill the plant pathogens. But sometimes if it's in a compost pile for a long time, the pathogens don't survive because of duration of time as well. So you can compost them, but I would definitely look into that more. I get more information about what you're specifically dealing with and how they work.
We're getting some about blossom end rot, and so I'm going to refer people back to a previous year's webinar where it was all about tomatoes. So I think
Um,
that's been covered. So you might want to go back and review by one of the Hort people who talked about it.
can
Um,
I can I just make a comment and
Go ahead.
emphasize that point? Blossom end rot's tricky, and I'm not an expert on it. But the more you know, the more likely you are to manage it. So that's great. Julie, I should probably watch that myself. I actually didn't know it existed.
I have to look back because I said there's 100 in
Yeah.
reserve. Few more questions. Do some of the fungal or bacterial spores splash up from bare soil to infect plants when it rains?
Yeah. The answer, the answer is that spores, an entire group of pathogens will produce spores that are more or less designed by nature to splash, to be splash dispersed. And so the answer is unequivocally yes. Um, you typically, a naked soil, you're not going to see a ton of that. But once you get started, once you have leaf material that has some of those spores starting, like that late blight pathogen, the potato one, those things will splash into the soil and infect the roots, the tubers, but other things will just splash from plant to plant. So sometimes you will see an area of a garden or whatever where you're just like, oh wow, what's that? And then after a couple rainstorms, it's everywhere, right? That a lot of that is splash dispersed.
Here's a really interesting question. As you work in the garden and knock into things, if you breathe any of this stuff in, is there a danger to humans or bringing it home on your clothing to pets and kids?
Oh, that's a great question. No, that really is. The general answer is no. So most of the yeah, well, let me have a caveat there. Almost every plant pathogen is really focused on plants. Plants and humans are quite different. Animals and humans are very similar compared to plants. So you're not really ever going to have to worry about a direct infection, with the exception of maybe having an immunocompromised situation, um, cancer, undergoing chemotherapy or something. Even then, it would be really rare, but then you have to think about some of those things a little bit more. In plant pathology, for plant pathogens, you're really pretty safe. There are a couple of things that are interesting that did influence history, and this might be a good topic at some point. There are a couple diseases that will cause a fungal structure that can cause a problem. So, ergot, if you've ever heard of ergot, that's one of them. So, you've got this fungal reproductive structure in primarily rye, but can occur in other cereal grains. And we don't worry about it anymore because all the grain is cleaned and whatever. But if you eat that, it's got a hallucinogenic LSD. And so if you've heard of the Salem witch trials, the reason that happened or what facilitated it was there was an ergot epidemic and the colonists were eating this infected rye. And they got enough of it that they started to have these hallucinogenic moments and they kind of went crazy and they did the Salem witch trials. So I mean that's an interesting example, extremely rare. So in general, you don't have to worry about any of these plant pathogens that I'm talking about. The worst scenario is probably that you eat a white mold, little black structure sclerotia, and you break a tooth. But it's a good question though.
Sam, you're definitely on my list for next year to come back to you. So we have one last question that we have time for. And well, actually, there's two parts. Can you burn the plant residue from infected plants? Is that a good thing to do? And then are there any natural fungicides?
Absolutely, you can burn it. Pathogens don't like fire. Absolutely, and it's not in some parts of the world, it's not abnormal to see people burning fields. And that really is to get rid of these diseases and the pathogens. So burning fields is a thing. The second part was natural fungicides. There are a lot of fungicides, but what's available to a homeowner, maybe an organic situation, I'm not entirely sure. So it is true. What we've seen is that the fungicides that work best that are used in field crops are synthetics, or they're, not. They wouldn't be considered organic, right? They're chemicals that are very effective that target a very specific metabolism site or something in the fungi or whatever it is attacking. Um, that's a good question. I'm not entirely sure of the answer. I know you can pick up things at maybe like Home Depot, but how effective they are, how natural they are, I'm not super sure.
I'm going to bring us to a close. Great seminar, Sam. Thank you so much for joining us today. And all of you viewers, participants, please put your ideas for next year's webinar series in the survey. And I want to give a special shout out to Ada and Scott for all their help in pulling these together. So again, thank you. And Sam, we're going to have you back. So we'll see you for sure next year.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.